And welcome again to Theories of Reality. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're going to continue on talking about free will. So, as you'll recall from last time, free will. One quick announcement. This weekend is the Asian celebration. I posted something on the social forum. Students can get in free if you volunteer or stop by. There's some bank, community bank. What was it? Oregon Credit Union, I think. You stop by, it's in the announcement, you stop by the Oregon Credit Union and they can get free student tickets there. So if you have your student ID and your free ticket from the Oregon Credit Union, you can get in for free. And it's You're the Dog, so it's big celebration, food, music, performances, all kinds of stuff there, vendors. So this weekend at the Oregon Fairgrounds. Take advantage of your student identity to get a discount and check out all the fun. All right. So free will. So free will. Remember, we first started talking about the definition of free will. So free will is having the power to have done otherwise under identical circumstances. Right, so you think about the idea is that given the same circumstances for a person growing up in poverty, having bad peer influences, going to a crappy school, having abusive or neglectful parents, the idea is that that person still has the ability to succeed in life. So if the person ends up becoming a delinquent or a criminal and ends up in prison, say, we feel that it's just to punish that person because they could have done otherwise. So to say that person had free will meant that even though they did turn to a life of crime and gang activity and sold drugs on the street corner and maybe, shot a couple of people, that they could have done otherwise, right? They could have done, you point some other person to school. How about that guy? That guy ended up, even though he had crappy parents too, and he went to the same school you did, and he had all the things going against him that you did, this guy ended up going to college. He finished high school and went to college and got a degree, and now he's working a regular job and supporting himself and is a pillar of society, right? So the idea is that the person who did something wrong could have done otherwise. Also, we give credit to the person who succeeded despite challenging circumstances, and we say that person is noble and good, and his parents rightly have pride at their son or daughter because their children have succeeded when they could have thrown their life away and failed in life. So the idea is free will means that whatever you did, whether it was really good or whether it was really bad, you have both the responsibility for your actions in the case where it's bad, and you also get the credit for your actions if they're good, right? And that's this idea that you could have done something else given exactly the same circumstances. Like you're there and maybe you're around your no good friends, and they're like, hey man, we're gonna go rob this liquor store. You wanna come? And you're trying to think oh, well, that sounds like a lot of fun, and I can get some money and some booze and go hang out all night, or I could go home and maybe get a lecture from my mom about staying out too late and go back to my crappy apartment and go to sleep, right? And you're trying to think, what am I going to do? Or I could study for that test tomorrow, right? And you're weighing the options, and you're thinking, what am I going to do? Oh, and then if you go out and rob the liquor store and get caught, and that getting sent to juvenile hall, and that might lay the groundwork for a life crime. So that's one choice you can make, or you could go home. And the idea of the free will says that whatever you did, given those same exact circumstances, both possibilities are open. You can choose one, you can choose the other. Now,
Also, something to add to it is when you're younger, I think it's the prefrontal cortex and its ability to predict things ahead of time
Mhm.
isn't fully developed. And so people that are younger that usually do commit crime, they can't really think ahead far enough as adults. And that's why adults get so angry at kids, because, you know, why are you doing these decisions? You know the aftermath, but they can't comprehend the aftermath of what will happen because of their actions. So, I mean, that's probably why they added the law that, like, once you turn 18, you get a clean record, or however that works.
And that's also why you can't, it's really hard to rent a car unless you're 25, because
Yeah.
that's when your brain
Yeah,
is
yeah.
just developing.
Yeah.
Um,
So, I mean, technically that could inhibit your ability to successfully have free will.
Well, it sounds like the termists talk.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like what the termists are going to say. And so so you ask the question, well, what about this guy over here? He isn't robbing a liquor store. He's like, he's applying himself at school, and he wants to go to college, and he's in the same, maybe it's like the same family, right?
Mhm.
It's the older no good brother and the studious, dutiful younger brother. And what's up with that? They're in the same family, in the same neighborhood, going to the same school. And the termist is going to say there's something that's different between those two people. And one thing it might be is their brains might be a little different. So it might be an element, even though they're in the same family and they're biologically related, every person's unique. They have unique biology. And it may be that the part of the brain that deals with, say, with judgment and impulsivity is different in one brother than the other brother. Mm-hmm. It could also be birth order. So there's psychology. Birth order shows you that the firstborn tends to be more outgoing, more extroverted,
More intelligent as well.
not
Usually, yeah, the first one that is born is actually more intelligent. In most cases. I mean, obviously that could change, but
fits my case, but I suppose that's a small sample. I'm 3 minutes. I'm 3 minutes older.
Twin.
I'm 3 minutes older than my brother. Also turned out to be the handsome one. So but there's birth order, and that might make a difference psychologically, because the firstborn tends to be the trailblazer, and so maybe the trail that they being more extroverted and outgoing in those circumstances means like joining the gang, engaging in a life of crime, doing aggressive things, trying to work out your way in the dominance hierarchy, as Jordan Peterson would say.
Yeah.
So it's like all trying to, and so it might be, and I just mentioned these things, factors. Why does one person become a criminal?
I would argue testosterone levels as well.
Yep, and another, let's say, college student, but I repeat myself. I suppose sometimes people become both, right? You take classes in the joint. But why does one person engage in a life of crime, the other person keeps their nose clean, and they study? And you could say it could be things like, so it might be something having to do with biology, and that's the brain. It could be development, even brain development. Suppose the first son, for example, suppose mom got pregnant when she still had a drinking problem. And so he's got like fetal alcohol syndrome. And part of fetal alcohol syndrome is, I think it's related to mood disorders, but it's also related to impulsivity. Mm. And impulsivity is like one of the biggest determinants of crime. It might also be, there might be different testosterone levels. Yeah, I need a new page, I guess.
It's just really hard to comprehend that, like, you can understand what's good for yourself, but your brain will choose something differently. Again, and that goes for a lot of cases for kids that are, younger and their brains aren't fully developed. Like, mm-hmm. They know themselves that it's wrong, but their brain still creates that impulse to do it anyway. And I think that's really interesting, because it seems almost as if they're their personality of what they think is right and wrong is disconnected from what their brain is going to choose to do for them. It kind of seems to be that way in some cases. I don't understand that.
It is an interesting fact, fact of psychology that some people, they think like they have a hard time wrapping their mind around long-term rewards, and that sort of that impulsivity is something that's more prevalent in some people than other people, and there's a lot of questions about how personality develops, but that all happens when you're really super young, like whether you're more outgoing, whether you're less outgoing, whether you're more aggressive or less aggressive, and then the things you associate pleasure and pain with seem related to psychology too. Let's see, what do we got here?
Yeah, I watched this thing about psychology, and it was the degradation of willpower or something like that, and it had to do with like the relation between how much energy you're consuming during like willpower phases, and how that has been like something that was known to be true for a really long time, but now they're coming out with studies that are proving it completely wrong, and that the mind might be able to create an unlimited amount of energy, and it's more of like, no, okay, I can go on a 5K run, but do I have the willpower to go and do that? It's interesting that you can almost talk yourself into anything that you want to do. That kind of breaks that whole willpower struggle in psychology.
Yeah, the motivation is
in a sense, like it's just pushing yourself that extra bit to get to the next level, and that's what military does as well, the 40% rule or something. I don't know.
So, and the conditioning. Let's put this here, conditioning, and even individual experience. So there's this sort of feedback loop that goes on where you have stuff happen to you and then react to it, and your reaction determines what's going to happen to you in the future, and it's a sort of constant interaction with you and your environment that gradually creates your personality and your character. And it's not exactly the same even for people in the same family. So like my twin brother, for example. So we're 3 minutes apart. We're growing up in the same family. We're almost always together. We're even in the same classes.
Do you actually have a twin brother?
I do have a twin brother.
Okay, you do actually have a twin brother. Okay.
But we went on to lead very different lives, develop some different beliefs. We have similarities, but there's also some big differences in our choices in life. And I guess it's due to the fact that our parents, that our experience was slightly different. And the older we got, the more divergent our experiences were, the more we were doing other things, and so our environments changed over time. But even those first 5 years of life that they say is formative of your personality, with identical genetics, living in the same place, being together most of the time, there's subtle differences in our experiences. Like I remember when we were kids, so it's kind of a downer. I was down there for this summer, and my mom brought out like the photo album book, and showing some friends I have there, and here's us going to the beach. And you see, my brother Julian's crying, and there I am, smiling. We're at the beach, and he is talking about this traumatic experience where, this big wave comes and hits him and knocks him over, and he's freaked out about it, like he's gonna drown. And I was talking about what a terrible experience it was, and as he's telling it, he's reliving it, and it's everybody's oh man, what's up with him, because he was kind of. Like it was like PTSD or something like that. Whereas me, I don't even remember it. I'm well, there's a picture of me at the beach, and my mom says it happened, so I guess it did, but I have no recollection of. Maybe I have a vague idea of going to the beach and seeing sand for the first time and the waves, but I don't really remember any details. Whereas him, it's really vivid, because he had this thing where he got knocked over with a wave.
It's like the brain creating bookmarks.
Yeah. So I mean might have been a formative experience. Maybe that was formative of his personality. So anyway, so the determinist. So we started out talking about free will and this idea of people having free choice as what they're going to do, and free will says given the same exact circumstances you can choose something different, and What the determinist is going to say is something like, well, you're never in exactly the same circumstances as somebody else. And there's always going to be a why. So, determinism, you're never in the same exact circumstances.
I feel like another
As someone else. So it's a hypothetical, right? The hypothetical is if you were in those same exact circumstances, you could have done something different. Like I remember, I don't know, when I was in grade school, there was this girl I was really sweet on, and all throughout high school I pined after her, and we were like friends. But every time I wanted to tell her my true feelings, she'd like have some other like jerk of a boyfriend, and they're all like a bunch of losers and delinquents too. It's just kind of sad. Or I guess she ended up with some nerdy guy in high school, and but I was like super shy, so I never expressed my feelings, and so free will says, well, I could have expressed my feelings, but I didn't. So so on each of those pivotal moments where I could have done one thing, I did something else. And this is where regret comes from, right? Mm-hmm. Why would you feel regret that you never told your true love how you felt about her, right?
It's because I think part of the development of the being is the butterfly effect. Certain events can actually have huge impacts in the long run that you can't even understand. Like even with your brother, it was something subtle. The wave hit him.
Yeah.
That totally led to a long-term trauma of that, where it totally kind of molded him as a person, in a sense. I mean, it's hard to figure out how much percentage of that identity was molded by certain events, but I definitely feel like any event that you do experience is just compounding and creating a different identity. And that's why everyone is different, because everyone has different experiences.
So you're never, so it's kind of a hypothetical you have a hard time testing, right? So the idea of free will is if you were in the same conditions, then you could have done something different. But it's like a counterfactual, right? You did something, you did one thing, and you have this idea, well, I did that one thing, or I didn't do that one thing, but I could have done something else, right? I could have studied hard for the test. I could have invested in Bitcoin. I could. So you have choices that you regret, and there's some where you think, I'm really glad I did this one thing, because and I didn't do the other thing. Right, so I mean, sometimes you're happy, you make the right choice, and you give yourself credit and praise for it, and you think, oh God, what if I would have done that other thing that I was thinking about doing?
That's why I think it comes down to probability of the identity, because people can make infinite amount of choices in their lives, but the probability of them making the correct choice is limited. So someone could have a probability of choosing 90% of the bad choices, and their life probably won't end up as positive, or they may not. Their identity would be, I would say, probably more negative than rather someone that has a 90% positive guess rate at doing something successful.
But the idea, the determinist would say, even though the outcome might, so there's certain probabilities that certain things, if you're trying to make a choice, you can sort of try to gauge the probabilities. But the idea is you can choose, you weigh the options and you pick something, right? And then you could pick one thing or you pick the other thing, and it's up to you which one you're going to pick. The determinist is going to say what you pick depends on all the things that happen to you in your beforehand, plus your current circumstances, plus your genetics, your heredity, your personality, which is a result of previous things. Personality largely related to upbringing. You don't get to pick your parents. You don't pick your culture. You don't pick the neighborhood you're born into. All the stuff that happens to you form your personality, and is when you're super young and don't have any control over your life. So the determinists are going to say that those things lead to your choice, and that even though it feels like you could have chosen something else, really there's only one thing you could have done, and that's the thing that you did do, because we live in a universe of cause and effect. So that and it's again the same exact causes will produce the same exact effects. And it's really an illusion that you think you could have done something else. So last time we talked about the argument from physics. This idea that the material world behaves in deterministic ways, and therefore you're not outside the law of physics. You're a material being. You're part of the world of cause and effect, and that you cannot escape causation. And think about it, and it's sort of arrogant to think about yourself as being outside the universe and of cause and effect. So that's then we talked about come back to that. So there's indeterminism in physics, the kind of weird quantum physics stuff that we see that shows that the universe doesn't behave all that indeterminism, all that predictably.
Did you watch that video yet?
I have not. I'll get to it this week. I'm a busy man. And it's I'm burnt out at the end of the day too.
Fair enough.
All right, indeterminism in physics. The other and then the question about indeterminism in physics is, and maybe I'll put a little thing here. There's a question about the micro, where you can go from the micro to the macro. Just because really weird things happen inside an atom, does that mean really weird things happen at the level at which you make decisions? And you could argue, well, no, it seems like wouldn't be the case. That just because weird things happen when you smash atoms together and look at the result, or try to figure out where an electron is or how fast it's going, that doesn't mean when you make a decision based on this 2.5 pound lump of matter in your skull, that's indeterministic. That's a level at which the laws of microphysical particles don't really apply. And then this, I didn't mention this last time, well, wouldn't that just make it random? So if it's indeterminate, what does that mean? I mean, like you look at the radioactive particle, I talked about like a particle emitting, a piece of like say radium emitting particles, and you put a Geiger counter up to it and it goes, click, 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 click. It's not uniform. The emission of particles seems to be random. But you over time you can say, well, it's about 60 clicks a second or whatever it is. So even though on average it's 1 click a second, 1 second might have 3 clicks, and then it might be 2 seconds where there's not any click at all. But that's a random pattern. So what would that mean for actions, right? It's like you wake up in the morning and maybe you've been like, you've been like really studious, keeping up your classes, and you wake up in the morning and says, and you say to yourself, I think I'll ship Coke and rob the 7-Eleven store, even though I have no history of crime in my background whatsoever, no influences.
It happens.
It would just be random, right?
I mean, I would argue, if the infinite universe theory is real, then there's an infinite amount of selves. There's an infinite amount of yous that make an infinite amount of decisions, just like what we're made out of has infinite probabilities. So there was a timeline where you did ask that girl out, and she did say yes. And there was a timeline where you did ask her out, and she said no, and then there was all these different timelines. So I think part of the human experience is attempting to find the best timeline.
Yeah, and it's sort of weird to think about like what would have happened like if you had made certain pivotal decisions when you're young. Now, the tendency, I think, for people is to they think about everything in their life, else in their life is exactly the same, but that one decision is different. And they think about there's sort of two parallel universes where there's the universe where I didn't make that decision and everything else is the same. But that doesn't make any sense because, as you said, those one decisions have ripple effects that you can't really even calculate or comprehend. And this is like a good thing about psychology is to whenever something that seems like it's bad happening, you can think, well, maybe it seems bad right now, but maybe this thing's going to lay the ground for greater success. Or sometimes you miss out on something. You're like, oh, my life is over because this Valentine's Day is past. So I'll just say like this person that you really that you were totally in love with like dumped your ass, right? So and you're like, oh, my life is over. But then it turns out like somebody else comes along that's like 10 times better. And so if you hadn't been like booted out of this really bad relationship, you wouldn't have found this really great relationship. But if it's random, I mean, what would that be like? It would just, does that mean, is that really free will if your actions are, if they're not determined, if they're just random, it seems that's not really freedom.
I wouldn't say that, like,
Well, you think about like what would it be like?
carefully.
It'd be just like rolling the dice. It'd be like what's his name, Two-Face, right from the Batman comics, flipping the coin. But what is he going to do? Is he going to do something evil or is he going to be doing something good? And he flips a coin to see. It'd be like every decision would be like that. So it seems that it's not enough for things not to be determined. Somehow you have to be determining them. So that's an issue there.
Maybe when you size up to macro, maybe it seems more selective than random. Maybe that's the difference between micro and macro is once you scale up from micro, instead of it being random probabilities, it's more predicted probabilities.
But then it seems like the element of determinism comes back when you deal with the large-scale objects.
I mean, you can have random things happen to you in your existence that could completely change you. Like, for instance, you could be taking the same way and then you choose to take a left for once and then you get in a car accident. I mean, right, sure. So sometimes you can make a choice that's seemingly random, you don't really care about it, it's not based on your beliefs or values. It's not a huge thing, like,
yeah.
Just because I moved that table, like, just a tiny little minuscule amount, it might have changed my whole future.
But there's a difference between things that happen to you and like how you make your decisions. So this is saying that, oh, you can make a decision based, and that physics doesn't determine what happens in your brain and the decision you make. But then you'd say, well, it's just indeterminate. It's like as Karl Popper says, it's like clouds, not clocks. It's like the weather. You can't really figure out what it's going to do. But if that's you, and you don't even understand your own motives and don't know what you're going to do, and you just do things at random, it seems like that's not really freedom either. It has to, like when you make a decision, it has to be based on your character and your values and your beliefs. And that's not the model of the sort of indeterminism in physics. It doesn't seem to fit. So that's at least, it seems like a problem for that comeback. Another one we have is, and I didn't mention this last time, is you could have like, let's see, so you could argue, free will like you have a soul, and your soul's not. Indeterminism. I want to make sure I've got the right level here. Argument from physics, indeterminate physics, the micro-macro problem, whether it's random, and then actually I think I wanted this to be. I'll make sure I'm clear which side of the argument I'm supporting here. So the argument from physics is determinism, and then so objection, one might be indeterminism physics, one might be the micro, whether the micro and macro levels translate, whether you can take indeterminism physics and go to the macro level. So that's actually a problem with the indeterminism physics. And there's also the problem with randomness, so I have my indenture right here. So if you try to say that, no, physics really is kind of physics is indeterministic, and so the argument from physics doesn't work, you can say, oh yeah, well, does the stuff we look at inside the atom really translate to the regular level of decisions, and then is it just random? And then you also can, and then another objection, you might say, well, what about the soul? The soul is free, right? We're not material beings. And then you could say, well, maybe the soul's determined.
I think if free will was real, like true free will, then there wouldn't be anything that would inhibit us from that will. So I feel like physics confronts us in everyday life, and because of that, we're forced to make decisions to combat physics. So our free will is more predisposed towards survivability because of physics. But if there was no consequences, if there was no, no rules to anything, it was pure free will, then that, I feel like, would be the true definition of free will. Heaven,
I'm not sure I follow you there.
So, because physics exists, there's certain things that we can't do. I can't just go fly up this building and fly to Mexico or something.
Right,
With my arms. That would be free will, you just make the decision and it happens. But because physics exists, the micro level, because micro works the way it does, it inhibits those decisions that we're capable of making. So I can't make the decision to do that because it doesn't exist in my reality. I can't just fly with my body.
Now watch those possessive pronouns. I'm talking about reality.
Oh yeah.
But no, you make. There's a little bit about this in the book at the beginning of the chapter on like what free will means, and people that believe in free will say that it doesn't mean like you have the freedom to do the physically impossible. So it's recognized that free will has limits. So it has physical limits. Those physical limits aren't necessarily like at the micro level, even though that's what the fundamental building blocks are what creates reality.
Yeah.
But it's just that those the laws of physics constrain what's possible.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying it inhibits what free will actually is and what we can define it as. We have free will, which is allowed by micro.
Well, it's a micro, but also like the macro too. So regardless of what,
if micro didn't exist, macro wouldn't exist.
I suppose that's true. So. If
the hard part is
if the macro existed, would the micro exist? The macro would exist as it is now without the micro structure underneath it.
Yeah, but
or vice versa. It seems like vice versa too.
Why it Yeah, are you saying that
we wouldn't have like the experience we have without the macro level things that we experience? I don't know. We're getting to heavy duty metaphysics. Let's get back to free will here. So you can say, okay, well maybe matter is not determined. Or you could say maybe we're not material beings, which is the second thing. Maybe I have a soul and my soul doesn't follow the laws of cause and effect. And then you might say, well, maybe your soul is what's determined. Maybe matter is just chaos theory and weird physics stuff, and it's not determined. And maybe if we were purely material beings, we could be free. But there's this sort of cosmic fate, or there's Calvinism says that human beings are controlled by either God or Satan, and Calvin compares the soul to a beast of burden. You're like a donkey, and somebody's going to be riding your ass, right? So literally, somebody's going to be riding your ass, right? And it's either going to be, God or Satan. If it's God, he's going to take you to prayer meetings. He's going to lead you to go around helping people.
But then that means that you couldn't commit wrong. But people that do good things still commit atrocities.
Wait till we get to compatibilism, and there'll be an argument against that. But
okay.
But so the idea is that your soul is determined. That you're not responsible for your actions. It's either God or it's Satan. And the idea is you don't get to choose who's riding you. That's the Calvinist view. But it seems like that's possible. At least if you're going to argue, it's all cause and effect, you might say, well, I have a soul that's free, but maybe not necessarily. So that's another counter argument to that. Then we talked about the behaviorist argument.
One last thing about the soul.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting, and that kind of proves what I was talking about. It doesn't prove anything, but it kind of relates to what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Of my soul is free. Yeah, your soul is free, just not in the physical world. Once you ascend to the heaven, then you have free will because your soul is free. There, the physical world can't inhibit you. But no humans.
And somebody like Descartes will say, well, you're constrained in your abilities, like what you can do in the physical world. That's limited by biology and physics. But at the level at which decisions are made, that's something that goes on in your mind, and that's not subject to the laws of cause and effect. So when you're making a choice, even though it's interfaced with the brain, the pineal gland, however you pronounce it, right? Even though it's going through your brain, it's really your soul at which you're making those decisions. It's your soul that has free will. Any other questions about? Anybody else have questions or comments about the argument from determinism physics? All right, it's sometimes it's hard to constrain these things and stay on topic just because they're so expansive.
Yeah.
And what we're doing here, we're also like every counter argument. A lot of these counter arguments are sort of bringing up the free will libertarian arguments. So they're sort of we're treating those while we're talking about behaviorism. So last time I talked about this idea. Imagine like two cases. Two accidents. One where a reckless driver is speeding through a school zone and plows into a gaggle of school children, and another case where a person has a seizure and has the same result. And the question is like, what would you think about these two people? Would you think about them differently or the same?
Differently.
Yeah, you'd probably think like
one made the conscious choice.
Yeah. So what behaviorism would say is that the seizure victim and they would say like the reckless driver, reckless but not reckless with a W, the reckless driver and a seizure victim are equally determined, and neither is responsible. So, and Skinner's thing is that we have these medieval assumptions where we think about human beings as having souls and having the capacity for free choice. And so when someone does something wrong, we blame them, and then we have this idea that they should pay for their crime in the terms of some kind of punishment, not so they won't do it again, but because they deserve it. And then we praise people that do good, and we give them credit for it. And Skinner says that's the wrong way to look at things. First of all, if you blame and punish people, that's not necessarily going to keep them from doing it again. It might disincentivize them in some ways, but it's not good. It's the negative reinforcement is actually not as effective as positive reinforcement. But this whole idea of blame and praise is kind of an outmoded way of thinking about things. What you need to think about is what kind of behavior is socially functional and what kind of behavior is socially dysfunctional. Instead of trying to make somebody pay for their crime, you should take criminals and try to rehabilitate them and try to get them to become functional members of society and figure out what it is about their environment and conditioning that made them go wrong and try to fix it so that they won't go on wrong in the future, and also to try to engineer society so that you get fewer people doing the same thing. Like take the school shooter, for example, right? That's what everybody's talking about. There's a school shooting in Florida. School shooter. So you have this school shooter, and so the reaction is like, oh, I've heard people on the radio saying, oh, he's evil and he deserves to be executed, and how can anybody do something like that? And he should pay for his crimes, right? And where Skinner would say, that's the wrong way of looking at this guy. You should think, like, what made him do what he did and try to figure it out. Is there something wrong with his brain? Is he mentally ill? There's some psychological stuff going on with him? He seems like he had some behavior problems. He was booted out of the school. And what was it that made him, engage in an act of mass murder?
Yeah, but I feel like if you take that way and you get real detail, like if you could know literally everything about his entire existence, you could drive it all the way back to him having an awful father that beat him or something like that. And then is the father now to blame because of his actions in the past, it led to this future. So is he now an accomplice? I don't know.
So there, I think Skinner would say, you know, he deserves death or whatever. So, figure out
Is he just as good?
figure out why. And you want to get beyond, you know, blame and praise, or as it says in his book, get beyond freedom and dignity. And instead, think about a human being as being like, you know, a chemistry experiment, or where you try to figure out like, why did this weird thing happen, and how can I either get it to happen again or not get it to happen again. So like you have, I don't know, like a person, yeah, it's not just, and we tend to study dysfunctional behavior more to try to correct it, but you also might take people who are like super successful. Like there's this Brendan Burchard book out now called High Performance Habits. So instead of looking at all the screw-ups, Brendan, who's up in Portland, is you know, semi-local, I guess. He said he went and studied like all the super high performers in business and athletics and in science, and tried to figure out what it is about them that makes them a cut above everybody else. What is it that makes them super successful? You know, he's like a what do you call it? Like a success coach, life coach, and so. And so he's doing scientific studies to try to figure out what makes people successful. And, you know, Skinner would approve, he'd say. And actually, you know, Burchard says it's all about habits that people have. It's habits that people cultivate. And these are things that successful people do, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, that makes them successful. So Skinner would say, figure out why, and, you know, and then, you know, set up society. You know, based on it, right? So you want to sort of engineer the great society. And
I would argue a main component of all these shootings, since January there's been 18 school shootings. I would argue that the reason they're being caused is because of the news. Glorification. People like to be noticed, and people that don't get noticed ever in their life, which there's a lot of us, even though there's media and everything, a lot of us don't get noticed by anyone. And what is the best way to do it? What do they see constantly over and over on these? This guy, his name is blah, 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 showing up all over the screen, showing his face, everything. It doesn't matter what the representation of the person is, it's the fact that you're getting recognition for something. Especially if you've never gotten recognition for anything good or bad. Yeah. It's recognition. I think that's why now that media and everything is so prevalent and there's so much of it, you get just billions of news stories about one guy, and now he thinks he's the top of the world because he did something shitty.
So like, yeah, so let's say it's feelings of
and that could be psychological as well.
Insignificance. You know, no one's paying attention to them, and this is, you get kids, like even small kids, will do things will cause trouble to get noticed, because even negative attention is better than no attention. So they're sort of like ignored, and so then you think about, well, what could we do with like kids when they're really young? Maybe you want to think about like self-esteem. Maybe teachers should, you know, look and see, like make kids feel significant and make sure that they feel like they're making a meaningful contribution to society, and try to do more to and then when somebody has behavior problems, instead of punishing them and telling them they're bad and wrong, you get them counseling and you try to see what's bothering them, and you also try to do things that make them feel like they're making a contribution, that their life matters, that people care about them, and so on.
I would argue the biggest thing that like every school system should have is meditation for kids.
Yeah, so I mean, that might do.
I don't think that worked very well.
Why not?
Thinking back when I was a kid, you think you could get me to sit still and meditate?
Yeah, no, it's tough, but I feel like, well, I mean, now with the app, the Headspace and stuff, like it's a lot easier to get into it rather than like being told, well, you have to sit here and be quiet and think about your breath for 10 minutes. Instead, it's more of like going to class, but now you get instead of doing math or literature, now you can actually sit and hang out, and then you go to research. I don't know.
No, I don't think that would work.
I mean, but do you think it would have a good psychological effect for the kids that did participate? That's the real question.
It would have to be voluntary.
Yeah, oh, I mean, of course, but
Yeah,
the kids that do
give
do it.
you do like give the kid a timeout or whatever, and give him a little meditation exercise, like put it on the wall in front of him where he has to stand in the corner.
Yes, I feel like this is like negative. That's negative reinforcement of something that's positive. It'd have to be a positive thing. Meditation wouldn't be something like, oh, well, we're gonna make you meditate because you did something bad. It's not like that. I'm saying just precautionary, like
Yeah.
before something bad happens, as like something that they teach.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's prevention, right? So,
Yeah, exactly.
so these are all things that you can do to have an intervention. And I think what Skinner would say is that treating human behavior as part of like the causal universe, and instead of trying to figure out, the other thing he would say is, you look at what people do and you see the conditions in which they do it. You can never know like what's going on inside a person's head. You can ask them questions, but they might lie to you. Sometimes people don't even know why they do what they do. So, but you really know, like if you look at a lot of different people and see what they do under particular circumstances, you can make some generalizations about what circumstances are likely to produce what kinds of behavior.
Categorizing.
Yeah, so that's the, and it's all, he'll say it's all about, again, the stimulus response. It's about certain stimuli are likely to bring out certain responses. So you figure out what the responses are that are desirable, and then you try to engineer the stimuli to produce those responses with sort of trial and error, and learn as you go. You can't do that if you're worried about punishing people and giving them what they deserve. Or giving credit and reward to people that do well too. That's going to do some of that, but it's not going to. It's not going to get at the root causes or give you the best result. It's sort of like a Band-Aid fix, and it's also based on this idea of morality. Now, I just want to wait to get the argument for moral responsibility when we talk about free will. Why don't we take our break a little bit early and we'll talk about Freud afterwards. And we think about like, whether you have control of your actions at all, or whether there's subconscious urges and desires that are like a little puppeteer pulling your strings all day long. Break time. Right.
Reagan,
Okay.
and just like super easy.
Here we are. Okay. The Freudian argument. So this is a psychoanalytic argument. So good. So somebody tell me what's Freud have to say about free will?
You hate your mother?
Yeah. Yeah. You. Why do you do what you do? Well, it's because of what happened to you as a kid, and what happened to you before you can even remember much about your life. Your personality was formed based on things beyond your control. So, you ever do something and you wonder, like, why the hell did I do that? And you're like totally, or you look back at some pattern of behavior and say maybe you had this goal that was really important to you, and then you did things which led to you not achieving that goal and seemed to sabotage you. Or do you know somebody else that maybe does the same, that's done the same thing? These things are usually it's harder to see them in yourself than to see in other people. Maybe think of an example of a person that seems like you think rationally their behavior seems to make absolutely no sense. There's got to be something going on with them maybe that they're not even aware of that's causing them to do what they're doing. Any thoughts about that? Oh, I'll just start an example. This is like a kind of stereotypical example. So I'll give two examples, so not to be sexist. So I'll start out with the one as that's the woman in bad relationships. So you see this pattern in certain women. They're attractive, desirable, sought after by lots of different men, and could have their pick of any guy. But they pick the alcoholic gang member who's violent and abusive. And maybe there's some evolutionary reasons why the warrior archetype is attractive. But they could choose the violent alcoholic gang member, or they could choose the guy who's like an engineer and maybe on the fencing team or something like that. And for some reason, the functional, athletic, good-looking guy who's an upstanding citizen is just doesn't do it for her. But the guy who with all the tattoos, who's in trouble all the time and has an FU attitude and kind of half the time pays attention to her, the other half the time totally ignores her, that's the guy for her. And she has this plan where she's going to reform him and make him into the engineer guy, right? the engineer guy who's maybe he's on the wrestling team or something like that. He's doing something he's a athletic macho guy, right? So it's not it's okay, there's the what do you call it? It's not like she's choosing between the sort of gruff man's man and some person that's maybe not as masculine. Suppose they're both equally masculine. But she'll go for the violent abuser. And then, there ends up being a terrible breakup, maybe a restraining order, visit the hospital. And so now she's thinking about her next boyfriend, right? And she's hanging out at the bar looking for a new boyfriend. and there's a guy who seems suspiciously similar to the last guy. Tattoos, kind of a jerk. Comes up with a sleazy come on line and is really super aggressive. And then when she doesn't respond right away, he insults her and goes and hits on the next girl. And she's like, oh, that guy really does it for me. I'm gonna see if I can take him home tonight, right? So you think about why would someone you think they would learn from experience, right? So you have the restraining order and the trip to the hospital, and you think, oh, I'm going to stay away from guys like that. They're bad news. But she does the same thing. Maybe this next guy, she ends up being in the wrong place at the wrong time when he's doing a drug deal or something like that, and she gets caught up and ends up going to jail, right? And then the third guy, who does she think about? Well, maybe maybe she's at the courthouse and she sees this guy going into the courtrooms who's trying to beat a burglary rap, and she's like, that guy looks kind of hot. I think I like him for my next boyfriend. And she's happy to find out he got a suspended sentence this time, so she's going to go out with him. You think, well, why would anybody behave like that? It's not like, so sometimes you get women that have like, maybe they're not that attractive, maybe they're getting up in years, and so they can't attract like a lot of men, and maybe they're not as, in competition, they're not that competitive. So maybe they'd have to lower their standards a little bit. But this woman's got everything going for her, that at least that men are looking for. And physical attractiveness is like at the top of most men's list. Youth is another, right? So if you got physical attractiveness and youth, and maybe you have a very kind of docile, agreeable personality, that's maybe like a third thing. That if you look at like what the sorts of things that men do, like on dating sites, what men are looking for. But so she could have her pick of she could have guys getting her out of her hands. Maybe a guy who's like super wealthy, maybe a guy who's super interesting. She could have the funny guy, but she goes for like the violent abuser. Why? Yeah.
I would say the lack of ability to predict the future. I feel like some people are more inept at that than others. And so being able to see situations, and I think that's what makes us so different from the rest of life on Earth. We're capable of thinking about the past, present, and future, and we're able to use the past and present to create predictions about the future. But some people lack that, and just like when an undeveloped mind before 25, they lack that future predicting pattern of the brain, and so that obviously leads to the same situations because they can't actually see what would happen.
That might be part of what's going on. Let's suppose, like in this particular person, suppose they're smart and they're really smart, and suppose they're themselves are maybe like an engineer. They're an engineering student. They're really good at like math and science, and they're good at like predicting things in the abstract. But when it comes to their personal life, and particularly their romantic life, it seems that maybe they have a part-time job, they're going to school full-time, they're pulling in straight A's. They seem very responsible, but there's this area in their life where they're always hanging out with these sketchy guys or getting into trouble. Well, the Freud would say, who's her father, right? He would say, look at what happened when she was growing up, what kind of father he had. And Freud would say, I'll bet you, dollars to donuts, or, I suppose, whatever they eat in Germany, Austria. But he would say, I'll bet you that her father was just like those guys she's dating, neglectful, abusive, maybe both. And that even though consciously she's not going out saying, tonight I'm going to try to take home a guy who's just like my father, a violent alcoholic abuser. If you ask her about her father, she might say, I hate my father. I haven't talked to him in 10 years. I try not to think about him. Deep down inside, there's this little voice saying, your father never loved you. Find a guy just like your father, and then your father will love you. And it makes no rational sense. And of course, her father might even be dead, right? But because when she's growing up, she has this neurotic conflict based on wanting to bond with her father, but her father never returning her love, that she's got this hole where she needs it filled. And these guys are proxies for her father.
And that's kind of what I meant by the subconscious butterfly effect, right? Those types of situations of having daddy problems.
And that's the daddy issues. You look at like strippers, prostitutes, and women that enable boyfriends who are career criminals, ended up getting caught up in their crimes. Inevitably, you find the daddy issues. So then. And the same thing, so you have guys that are the same way. Typically with the guys is issues with their mother, and they end up with all these women that are domineering, who, there's guys, they share an email address with their girlfriend. They have, order about, I don't know, I won't go into examples, but you probably all know like guys like this that have their their wives are, they're always saying yes, dear, and they're always, she's the one that wears the pants in the family, orders them around. They say, oh, I'd like to, but my girlfriend, my wife needs me to do X, right, all the time. And there's a reason why it's doing this is like seeking the approval of their mothers, and their girlfriends or their wives are proxies for their mothers. Now, they don't say like, I'm going to marry, I'm going to marry a gal just like the gal that married dear old dad, right? But subconsciously, there's this thing saying, you need to go find, your mother never loved you. She was always telling you what to do, and you were always displeasing her. If you can get this woman who's just like your mother to approve of you, then you'll finally feel loved, right? And so that's part of what's going on with that. So this is all stuff that goes along, under below the radar, that you have no idea how it's happening. Anybody that's in relationships or in their behavior, say about their career, or can you think of cases, these like psychoanalytic explanations where rational explanations seem to make no sense, or you think maybe there's something going on there?
Well, here, my idea that the successfulness of a child, whether he be intelligent, successful, understanding, street smart, and I wonder if that has a direct correlation with how capable a parent is at teaching. Because imagine if you had an adult that was very intelligent, understood life very well, had a kid, but he was awful at explaining things, miserable. That kid wouldn't gain any knowledge from that. He would be lacking because of that lack of teaching. So I mean, for people like these that do have these parents that might seem domineering or awful and don't love, aren't capable of teaching their kids, and over time that just kind of builds up, and then you end up with people that don't have life skills like they should have, even though they had the opportunity to learn it. They just weren't met with the learning aspect of it, the teaching aspect of it.
Yeah, and that's why it's good to read to your kids when they're young and stimulate them, and you get and that's what happens when you're young is you internalize things, and this is why, like, you think about morality, for example, right? So if you blame, if a kid does something wrong and you tell them no and you punish them, and they do something right and you praise them and reward them, then as they grow up, they will learn to associate pain with doing wrong things and pleasure with doing right things, right? So you get this sort of internalized behavior, and then you get internalized behavior, and this is what we call the superego, aka your conscience, right? So the superego is a sort of rule follower. John Hospers calls it your inner Hitler. And typically, your superego tells you you're bad and wrong. It tells you to wait in line, be a good boy, do your duty, follow the rules, and make sure that order is preserved. Do what you're told. Yeah, and so that comes from like your parents, ordering you about, telling you to do things, telling you to brush your teeth and clean up your room and all that stuff. And after a while, if you're like Freud would say, if you're like a functional person with a healthy superego, you walk into your office and you're like, this place is a mess. I better clean this up. It looks terrible, right? So that's like the sort of the superego, telling you, like, basically the superego emerged from all the times your mom told you to clean your room, and now it kind of bothers you. You're not sure exactly why it bothers you when things are too messy, and you want to clean them up and make sure to bring order back. And so Freud has this tripartite idea of the mind, where you have these three parts. There's the id, there's the superego, and then there's the ego. So the superego is sort of like your conscience, but also has to do with order and rules. And then your id has to do with your like primal instincts and drives. Sex, food, power, resources, all your animal instincts. And then the ego is sort of like an inner diplomat that sort of moderates between the two. And what you do, this is like your conscious mind. Not your conscience, but your conscious mind. Now, all this stuff goes on below the radar, though. So even the ego moderating between the two things, and then it sort of pops up, oh, this is what I should do. So you're, you give this example in the book, you're at the pizza place, you're waiting for your pizza, and it's been like 20 minutes, and you notice these people that came in after you, they get their pizza, and you don't have a pizza. And you're like, that pizza scene, you're really hungry, and you're like, that pizza smells really good. And you're looking over that pizza, and you're like smelling the pizza, and you're like, oh, I like to just go over and grab a piece of that pizza and stuff it in my mouth and eat it like all in one gulp. And then like the superego says, no, that would be wrong. That pizza does not belong to you. You must respect the property rights of others. And the id says, but that pizza looks really good. I really want it. And hey, that girl over there with the pizza, she looks really hot too. You know what I like to do? And then she's with that guy, and it's like, why guys like that get all the hot chicks? I want a hot chick like that. And so you like, the ego wants to mate with the hot chick and wants to do violence to the guy that's with him. So he's like, so the ego says, you know what you should do? You should go over there, punch that guy in the jaw, take the girl, throw over your shoulder, and grab the piece in the other hand and run out the door. and the superego says, no, that would be terrible. You should feel bad and wrong for looking at that woman who's not your girlfriend. That girl is with another person, and it's right. And sex is dirty and bad, so you shouldn't even be thinking about that. And just wait your turn. You'll eventually get your pizza, right? And so the ego tries to work between these two things. You think about them as being the stereotypical devil on your shoulder and the angel on your shoulder. And so what you might end up doing is just going to the counter and saying, hey, where's my pizza? And complaining, right? And maybe you have a little bit of an attitude, and that's from the id, a concession to the id being pissed off about not getting your pizza. But you're not, socking the guy in the jaw and stealing his pizza and his girlfriend and running out the door either, right? So it's a compromise.
So the superego is basically a listed ruling of how you should act in society, but that list of rules is created by the parents.
Yeah, so when you're an ego, like when you're a kid, you're like all id, right? It's like when you're a baby, you're hungry and you just cry bloody murder until you get fed, right?
Yeah.
Or you need to be changed. You cry bloody murder until you get changed, right? So anytime you want something, you just scream and cry and you get it. That's the id. And some people never grow out of that. They don't get their way and they pitch a fit. But eventually, like you learn that there are certain rules, and to get what you want, you have to follow these certain rules. And then over time, these all get like tamped down in your subconscious mind. So maybe like you're a little kid and you see something colorful and interesting, and you want it, and you reach out your little hand and try to take it, and your parent might say, no, that's not yours, and they put it back, right? And that your brain logs that back in its memory, and you get that over and over again. Pretty soon, you might like reach your hand out, and then you hear this little voice that says, no, that's not yours, and you pull your hand back. Maybe one time or another you reach your hand out for something and it's slapped down, right? Or maybe you get a spanking and your mind logs that back. Stealing equals pain and disapproval, right? Maybe your parents tell you no and make a really mean face at you, right? And when you're a little kid, it's disapproval can sometimes be worse than physical pain. So anyway, this is all going on. You don't have any idea this is going on. And they've done, to prove the subconscious mind, they've done these experiments with hypnosis. Like sometimes they'll do things where they'll have a person and they'll be sitting in a room, and they'll give them hypnotic suggestions. They put under a deep state of hypnosis so they can talk directly to the subconscious mind, and they'll say, okay, after you awake, you're gonna go over to the window and open it, right? Okay, wake the person up. The person gets up, goes to open the window, sits down, and the experimenter says, "Why'd you open the window?" What do you think the guy who opens it says?
I don't know.
You think he'll say, "I don't know"?
Yeah.
They always have a reason, right? Always, always, always. They'll say, it was stuffy in here, I was hot. Doesn't matter how hot or how cold the room is. They'll say, I needed some fresh air. But they always give a reason.
They want a reason for their delusion.
So this idea that subconscious mind calls the shot, and that, so that the conscious mind
Verifies it.
just rationalizes
Okay.
decisions made by the unconscious mind.
Do they know the different regions of the brain that the subconscious is in and the conscious is?
Actually, that Freud's theory of the tripartite mind has actually been mapped onto maps of the brain, and they think they know which region is like the id, the superego, and the ego.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of interesting that modern neurology has at least some verification. I don't think it's exact, but it seems to fit pretty neatly with Freud's ideas. Even though some of Freud's other ideas are a little out there, but he's in the 19th century, so.
Because I feel like the ego has a lot to do with evolution. So the superego. Because you would do that. You grab the girl, grab whatever.
Yeah, it's the id. Yeah, it's all.
But now that society's changed, evolution has occurred. The consciousness also needs to evolve and adjust itself.
Yeah. So that the idea is that you have all this stuff going on below the radar, that's kind of pulling the strings, and you feel like you're in control of your life, but really it's like, even like you look at some guy who's I don't know, some hyperachiever, right? And he's working himself 90 hours a week, and he's he lives for his job, and the question is, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody work so hard? Driven, almost no sleep, no room for anything else except for his career.
Because they don't know any better.
So one theory is this all has to do with being attractive to a mate. Now the person isn't thinking hey, if I'm super successful and capable, that I'll be able to attract a good mate. But the idea is in their subconscious is they're super intelligent, they're super capable, and they're doing this subconsciously to try to attract a mate. And it's because women tend to be attracted to men who are capable, and not even just have a lot of money, but who have the capability of high social status. So it's even at least a thought about why, so Freud has this theory, it's called transference, which is related to this, which is this idea that men have this libido that drives them crazy, and so if it takes over, it can put you into deviant behavior. So society channels this into more socially acceptable behavior, and the same thing with aggression, right? So men want to mate with everything that moves, and they want to punch everything in the face that gets in their way. And so what do? Well, we set up this society where men engage in ritual combat and sport. They fight for dominance in business and in their career, and sometimes in games of chance, right? So they compete with other men in these non-violent ways, and also compete for mates in different ways, other than clubbing them over the head and taking them back to the cave. And then also there's this idea that the libido is, and actually I don't know if the transference, I'm not sure that's the right word for it now I'm thinking about it. but that the libido is channeled into other activities. So men have this drive to mate, and it gets channeled into this idea of being a successful career person to attract a mate. But again, this idea is it's all has to do with like, I mean, for Freud, it's like all your behavior has to do with things like whether you feel powerful enough, and about like sex and, you know, toilet training. Freud explains all your personality traits based on these sort of animalistic things, basic human biological functions. A lot of people are skeptical about that Freud maybe went overboard with some of these things, but it seems like you can find a lot of these cases where it seems that people, their behavior doesn't make rational sense. So you think, well, why is that person doing what they're doing? So you have neurosis and hypnosis.
Neurosis.
So neurosis is when you engage in neurotic behavior, which is it's behavior that makes no rational sense. It's self-sabotaging. It's irrational, and like you might have a neurotic conflict. Like you want to have a good relationship, and so you pick a person that you have absolutely no prospect for a good relationship with, which is likely to end in pain and like have a big fallout. And then you do it repeatedly, even though, like, after the first two bouts, you do something that's going to bring about exactly the same result. And the idea is that doesn't make any sense rationally, so you go to the idea there's something wrong with that person having to do with their subconscious. And then the hypnosis is another, so I'll just say proof for the unconscious. So how do we know all this stuff is going on if we're not directly aware of it? Well, there are neuroses. Maybe I'll put neuroses. I guess I like neurosis hypnosis because it rhymes, but there's lots of different neuroses people have, and then hypnosis will show that the subconscious mind works. So as I think I mentioned this when we were talking about near-death or past life regression. There are people that can have their teeth drilled while they're under hypnosis with no anesthesia, right? Hypnosis is real. It really works. And people will do things like you can put your arm into a vat of ice water for like a minute, which is super painful. But people can bear the pain because they're under hypnosis. So what do you think about all this stuff? How do you know? Is there really room for free will if your personality is formed when you're really young and you have all these unconscious drives that are driving your behavior, and then all you have when you're asked, like, why did you do that, you're just giving a rationalization after the fact for what your id and your superego worked out between themselves?
I mean, that's why I think you should always question yourself. You know, if you do make a decision, always question that decision. You know, why am I making that decision? What is the reason I'm making that decision? What outside forces are making me make this decision?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you get to a point where you start to realize how maybe society shaped the reason you make that decision, or why your parents shaped the reason you make that decision, or why you personally shaped yourself to make those decisions. I mean, yeah. So if it's possible to actually mold your own subconscious, I mean, is that possible? To be able to shape your own subconscious with your conscious thought?
Yeah, so this might be like an argument against this. You might say, like, maybe I can, maybe I don't have direct effect on my subconscious, but I might have indirect effect.
Yeah.
So,
why not direct?
Because I think your conscious mind, like, you don't have direct access to it. Like, I can't, like, peer into my subconscious mind and see what's there. You have to, like, put me under hypnosis and ask me a bunch of questions.
Meditation.
Yeah, maybe meditation. I mean, meditation is very similar with hypnosis.
Vipassana claims that is actually what helps you tap into your subconscious. Vipassana is where you meditate for 10 days straight.
Wow.
10 days straight. You take eating breaks and you sleep, but you don't speak. You meditate for 8 hours a day, and then next day, 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours. You do that for 10 days, and supposedly that's such an intense amount of time that you start to enter different parts of your brain that you usually don't access because you don't do that. It's not a normal thing. And so
Interesting.
they actually did the study with prison mates in India and in the United States to see if it would actually change how they behaved and how they thought about their actions. And drastically different. Really good shows if you want to watch them. There's a couple documentaries.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
So if you get access, this is like Freud would do these things like free association. So he'll say, you know, I'm going to say a word, you say whatever word comes into your mind, right? And so, you know, he says like, you know, and so if he says, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like something like, the idea is that he picks words that are sort of going to bring up things and try to figure out what's going on with you. You know, mother, hate, right? And usually it's not that easy, but the idea is that if you're just sort of sitting there randomly thinking about, like someone says a word, you know, envelope, draft notice, or something like that, there's something going on with those responses you give, and you collect them and you try to see a pattern. And so, and the other thing they used was like I mean, Freud didn't use these, this came on later, the Rorschach test, the ink blots. So you look at an ink blot and see what you see, and the idea is that what you see, you know, there's this like, have you ever seen Duckman? Duckman is, he's seen a psychiatrist and he's showing him these ink blots, and he's like, why are you showing me a picture of 10 sailors wrestling naked on a rubber mattress? Right? So it's like, so the idea is that whatever you see in the pattern is you know, is saying something about what's in your subconscious mind. So the idea is that you can't directly access it, but through hypnosis and through some other means, and I just the free association or ink blots, you can get at what's in there. But you might say, well, maybe you can get therapy, right? And you know, reprogram your subconscious mind. So here you have a kind of indirect control. So maybe, like, you think about a person with a hand washing compulsion, right? So I have a compulsion to wash my hands 100 times a day, say. Or I have some phobia. I have a phobia of spiders, say. Or water, right? So the idea is that, okay, maybe I can't not be afraid of a spider. And maybe I can't not wash my hands even. It's like an overwhelming compulsion. But I can go get therapy, and with the spiders, you know, I can do like sensitivity training where I can like look at pictures of spiders and get used to that, and then maybe I might like look at a spider in like a cage or something, and then maybe eventually I might like, you know, get to the point where I'd like sit next to a spider that's not in an enclosure, and I might let a spider walk on me would be the last thing, right? So it's sort of so there are things I can do to get rid of phobias, to get rid of things that I program my subconscious mind. Like if I feel guilty all the time, there might be some way to reprogram myself by looking in the mirror and telling myself that I'm a good person or something. And the idea is through repetition, if you repeat things and you really feel those things and try to call to mind positive emotions, that has an effect over time, and it drills it into your subconscious mind. So the idea is that if your parents did all sorts of screwed up things when you were a kid that made you screwed up as an adult, you can reprogram those things by doing those same exact things. Well, not, you know, so you can do the same kinds of things, reprogram your subconscious mind and redo the damage your parents did and kind of rewire it.
I would say as well, like molding your identity and who you are and how you interact with people is really important to be able to get an idea of how you actually are to people rather than how you are to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So like, let's say you go to a party and like you're an asshole the whole time. You know, you're just doing plenty of party fouls.
And you don't realize that you're doing all these awful things, and as you're leaving the party, door is just slowly closing, and you hear, oh, I hate that guy. It's that realness of people that a lot of people don't interact. Or if, let's say you do go to a party and you have a great time, you're really kind to everyone, really, like, you're having a good time, and you leave and the door's closed, and you're like, oh, I really, really like that guy. I feel like that has such a strong effect on you because now you know for a fact it isn't what they're just telling me that I want to hear. It's the reality of what I am. And so I think that's really important, but we don't get that enough to be able to shape our identity. It's a rare occurrence to actually have that happen. So
Yeah, and that has to do with, I guess, people trying to, be agreeable and get along with others and not rock the boat. We can come back to what we're doing here. So, so these are. So it seems like you could get therapy, and is your subconscious mind coming back to the free will question, right? Does this rule out free will if your subconscious mind is calling the shots and making you do what you do, unbeknownst to yourself? And the idea is that if you have some neurotic behavior, you can always get therapy and get more control over your life and get rid of these dysfunctional behaviors and self-sabotage and feelings of guilt and so on that might be following you around. And the other thing is that you could, neuroses are often narrow, or at least let's say they're not all-encompassing, right? So it might mean that you don't have freedom in one area, but maybe you're okay in other areas. Neuroses are rarely, all-encompassing. Encompassing. So maybe like the guy with the hand washing compulsion, maybe his relationships are fine. Like he can, the women that'll put up with his hand washing compulsion, his germ phobia. Maybe the relationships he has are otherwise okay. Maybe the woman with all the bad relationships and abusive relationships, maybe her career life is just fine. And maybe her family life's probably screwed up. But maybe she's really great with her career, right? So the idea is that it's not like you're either neurotic or you're okay. And then what about like all the people that don't have a lot of these neuroses? And this is the idea that most of the time, conscious motivation explains your action. Most of the time, I guess this is kind of dated example, like Mac or PC, I guess. I think I put IBM compatible computer, which is really old. I guess I should revisit that. But whether you use a Mac or a PC, like I got my Mac here. I love my MacBook Air. Whether I use a Mac or a PC is just, it's not, is there something that happened in my past where I was traumatized and joined the cult of Mac or? So for most of your everyday decisions, what you decide to do during the day, probably not some subconscious motive. It's probably just you think about so I like the Mac because I get an educator discount because the hardware was a little more reliable when I got it. It was more user friendly. At the time I got it, it was like Windows 3, which was not very user friendly at all. And now, they've grown together where they work very similarly. So, but this idea that there's some sort of secret subconscious motivation for, what computer I choose or whether I why I like the barbecue flavor Pringles or something like that. They just taste good. So it seems like the only reason you go to these unconscious motivations is when somebody does something that doesn't make sense. And then you say, there's something weird is going on there. But how often does that happen? Now, I think Freud would say, the successful people, it's the same thing. You might have a kid who, has some form of experience where he's at the Little League game, it's tied in the ninth inning, and his coach, puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "You can do it, Johnny." and then he hits a home run, and he's the hero for a day, and that like lodges in his subconscious mind, and he gets this belief, you can do anything, Johnny.
That's why I think you can actually mold your subconscious with conscious, because if you tell yourself that you are going to be successful at something, you are good at something, you can actually change that in yourself. Yeah, like, for instance, I'm kind of really bad with names. I just couldn't remember names. They tell me my name, it'd go out the other side, you know? But I try to hammer home, like, no, I'm good at this. I can do this. You know, it's that mental, like just like he says, you can do it, Johnny. It's almost like if you tell yourself enough times, that willpower will pass through. I totally believe that.
And you're reprogramming your subconscious mind in doing that.
Exactly.
So you have indirect control of your subconscious mind. You just don't have direct control. And so maybe is that really going to interfere with your free will? And I think you might say that even though you might have some stuff going on in your subconscious that kind of might push you one direction or the other, it doesn't rule out free will. At the most, it might constrain it in a few areas, and even those areas you might be able to fix it. Yeah.
What would happen if you did actually have full control of your subconscious and conscious? What would reality be like to you?
That's a good question.
It's a tough one.
Since we have 10 minutes left, let's move on and talk about libertarianism.
No.
Come by office hours, we can talk about it. So the libertarianism is the view that we do have free will. So we've sort of been arguing against determinism by making libertarian arguments. And remember, libertarian, even though it's the Libertarian Party and libertarian philosophy, it has to do with the root word liberty meaning freedom, but it's not a political view. It's a metaphysical view. And so you can have metaphysical freedom without having political freedom. So, for example, it could be the case that there is free will, and it could also be the case that, like, a person living in a North Korean concentration camp, might have no political liberty at all. It might be that he has to work in the work camp and is starving to death and is likely to be killed if he tries to escape, and maybe his choices politically are really few. But it could also be that that he has free will, and he gets to make choices in his limited scope there, and he can choose. At the very least, he can choose how to perceive the circumstance and how to cope with it, and he can make internal decisions about his attitude. Say, so libertarian arguments. Take these in order. We talked about the argument from indeterminism in physics. Let's come back to moral responsibility.
I think moral responsibility is just a guideline imposed by the public.
Okay, so you're a moral nihilist. Well, remind me never to turn my back on you. For the rest of us who aren't psychopaths, there's this idea that a person's responsible for their actions, and that there's right and wrong, good and evil, and that the person, if they do a bad thing, they are morally culpable for those actions. And if a person does a good thing, then they deserve moral credit, and we should praise them. This doesn't really make sense under determinism. Remember that the determinist will say that the guy that has a seizure and the guy that's just driving recklessly should be treated exactly the same. Maybe your how to keep them from doing it again might be different, but he would say, Skinner would say neither is more responsible than the other. And Skinner would say the mistake is to say that the guy who plows into school children could have done otherwise. And Skinner would say, no, if you look at his past, you look at his father who's you got a lead foot, you look at him growing up with his father's obsession with the muscle cars, with the kids. Maybe he has an innate desire for excitement and novelty inherited from his father. And you look at all those things, including perhaps even his father joking about speeding through school zones as being what real men do, right? So eventually, like and he would say all those causes led to that behavior. And so it's stimulus response. It's not like he could have done something differently. And to think that is the same as thinking that a person could like choose not to have a seizure. That psychological causes and biological causes are equally inevitable and lead to equally inevitable results. But that just doesn't seem to fit with our experience. We do blame the reckless driver and not the guy who has a seizure. Yeah.
Sort of on the topic of what I was talking about, like why morality exists in the public is, okay, so killing is wrong, right? Killing is wrong. But if someone kills Hitler, all of a sudden that's good. That's a good thing.
Okay, this sounds like a side issue about the legitimacy of morality.
Yeah, I mean, kind of.
I'm going to move on though. So let's assume that morality is real, for the sake of argument, right? So the idea is that if there's no free will, then there's no moral responsibility, right? These two things go hand in hand. Like if you couldn't help what you could do, then how can you be blamed for it? Responsibility, right? So then you start out with this. If there's no free will, there's no moral responsibility, and so Skinner will say, well, it's just that Skinner will say there's no free will, therefore there's no moral responsibility. This is the modus ponens, right? But you could also say, well, there is moral responsibility. And I'm just going to abbreviate here. There is moral responsibility, therefore there is free will. Modus tollens. There is free will. There's this saying, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. And this is a good illustration of this. So you start out, like both Skinner and the libertarian will agree that free will and moral responsibility go hand in hand. Skinner would say, science tells us there's no free will, therefore we should junk the idea of moral responsibility. But the libertarian will say, you can't junk the idea of morality, so therefore there has to be free will. So the fact that we do blame and praise people, and it's unimaginable that a person like a school shooter or some this horrific criminal, a child molester, genocidal maniac, pick your favorite villain, this idea that people who do wrong aren't blameworthy for their actions, or people who do good things aren't praiseworthy. And the idea that people don't deserve moral credit or blame for their actions is incomprehensible. Therefore, since we want to hold on to that idea, therefore we get to hold on to our idea of free will. So moral responsibility is part of our experience as human beings. We can't imagine that there isn't such a thing, therefore there has to be free will. What do you think about this as an argument? You're a moral nihilist. Of course, it's not going to be convincing to you.
It's not awful. I mean, I do understand the reason for morality. I feel like that makes more of like a structured society. Because if you have everybody that agrees on the same morals, you're going to have people that are going to get along better, which is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Following the line of morality, I guess, could be an indication of free will. Yeah.
Again, it's maybe try to put yourself in the place of like, I think most people would say there's the right and there's the wrong. The person has a conscience. That when someone does something bad, they're blameworthy. It's not just that we try to keep them from doing it again. They deserve punishment. That's why most people approve of sending people to prison or giving them a fine, at least if it's a small thing. And it's not, so it might be not to do it again, but also there's this idea that people that support the death penalty, for example, It's not like you're giving the death penalty to keep them from doing it again, because you give them life in prison. You give someone the death penalty because they killed multiple people, because they tortured someone to death, because they did something horrific for which only death is an appropriate punishment, because that's what they deserve. And so that's the argument for moral responsibility will say that people who do horrific things don't deserve blame, that they're just, they're acting according to their environment. They had no control over any of their actions, and so therefore they're not blameworthy. And that just doesn't seem like a realistic way of looking at the world.
No, and the reason is because you can mold your subconscious. That's why. Because if that was the case and they were just acting in their own environment and they just do all these awful things because of their environment, then that means that controlling the subconscious is completely impossible. But the people that don't do these things, that are also placed in the same-ish situations but don't act that way, have obviously been strong enough or have that willpower that I was talking about to be able to mold their subconscious.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like that's all we have time for today. So we'll talk about the arguments from intuition, deliberation, and regret on Tuesday, and finish up